A woman forces her mother-in-law to leave her own home, all behind her husband's back, but when she saw her return with 12 police officers, she started sweating profusely. 5 years earlier, Gabriela had seen in Tomás the promise of a life of luxury and ease. He was the heir to a family fortune, a young engineer with a bright future, while she, an ambitious woman from modest beginnings, had played her cards well, seducing him with promises of eternal love and devotion. However, fate, ever whimsical, had other plans. The Acosta family business declared bankruptcy shortly after the wedding, dragging Gabriela's dreams of opulence down with it. Now, they lived in a family inheritance, scraping by on Tomás's modest salary and his mother Olga Gutierrez's pension. Olga entered the room, her slow and labored gait revealing the weight of her years and a life of hard work. "Gabriela, dear, could you help me with dinner?" she asked with a tired but kind voice. Gabriela turned, her face a mask of feigned concern. "Oh, mother-in-law, I'd love to, but I have a terrible headache. You should rest. I'll handle everything." Olga nodded, grateful for what she thought was her daughter-in-law's kindness. As the elderly woman withdrew, Gabriela smirked maliciously, her thoughts drifting to Juan, the handsome neighbor she had been flirting with. "If only I could get rid of this old woman," she thought. "Tomás and I could sell the house and start fresh." The sound of keys in the door announced Tomás's return. Gabriela hurried to the kitchen, ready to play her role as the devoted wife. The curtain was rising on another night of deceit and manipulation in the Acosta Gutierrez home. The next morning dawned grey and cold. Olga struggled to rise, her joints protesting with each movement. At 70, the weight of age and a life of hard work were felt in every fibre of her being. Nevertheless, she made her way to the kitchen to prepare the family breakfast. As Olga fought to reach a pan from the top shelf, Gabriela entered the kitchen, her face perfectly made up, contrasting with her worn silk robe. "God, Olga, breakfast isn't ready yet. Tomás needs to leave in half an hour," she snapped irritably. Olga apologized softly, her trembling hands hurrying to turn on the stove. Gabriela watched her with barely concealed contempt, drumming her fingers on the kitchen table. "You know, Olga, if you can't manage the housework, maybe we should consider other options," Gabriela hinted, her voice sweet but laced with venom. The old woman paled at the implication. "No, I can't do it alone. I just need a bit more time," she replied, fear evident in her quivering voice. As Olga toiled in the kitchen, Gabriela retreated to the living room where she pulled out her phone and started texting Juan, the neighbor. A malicious smile spread across her lips as she planned their next secret meeting. Tomás appeared next. Gabriela distractedly kissed her mother-in-law on the cheek before sitting at the table, where Olga served breakfast with trembling hands, spilling a bit of coffee. "Mum, be more careful," Tomás exclaimed, patiently cleaning the stain. Gabriela reappeared, all smiles for her husband. "Don't worry, darling, I'll clean it up. You just eat peacefully," she said, casting a reproachful glance at Olga while Tomás ate quickly, oblivious to the tension around him. Olga retreated to wash the dishes, her shoulders slumped with guilt and helplessness. Gabriela, meanwhile, was already planning how to spend the grocery money on an outing with friends, indifferent to the household needs. The clock signaled the start of another day in the house, where, beneath the facade of normalcy, dramas were slowly brewing that would soon have devastating consequences. The sunset painted the sky orange when Tomás Acosta returned home, his face marked by the exhaustion of a long workday. As he opened the door, the aroma of a freshly prepared stew greeted him along with Gabriela, who rushed to greet him with a rehearsed smile. "How was your day, my love?" Gabriela asked, helping him remove his coat. However, her eyes did not reflect the affection in her words. Tomás sighed heavily. "Another tough day. The boss is pushing to finish the project and the numbers don't add up," he replied, collapsing onto the sofa. Gabriela sat beside him, caressing his arm with feigned concern. "Don't worry, darling, I'm sure you'll figure it out." "You're the best at what you do," she flattered, while her mind wandered, imagining a different life away from this mediocrity. From the kitchen, Olga watched the scene with a mix of sadness and resignation. She could see through Gabriela's facade, but knew her son was blind to his wife's true nature. "Dinner is ready," Olga announced softly, wiping her hands on her apron. Thomas smiled at her gratefully. "Thanks, Mom." "I don't know what we'd do without you." Gabriela rolled her eyes, annoyed by the comment. "Oh, I'm sure you'd manage," she murmured under her breath. During dinner, Gabriela dominated the conversation with trivialities, subtly manipulating Tomas to sympathize with her. Olga remained silent, intervening only when necessary. "By the way," Gabriela said casually, "I was thinking of inviting the girls over tomorrow for coffee." Tomas frowned. "Gabriela, you know the budget is tight this month." "But darling, I won't spend much more. I deserve it after all I do for this house," Gabriela insisted, her voice a mix of reproach and sweetness. Olga watched as her son gave in to Gabriela's manipulation once again. Money meant for basic needs would be squandered on frivolities. After dinner, while Olga washed the dishes, she overheard Gabriela talking softly on the phone. "Yes, Juan, I'll be free tomorrow. Tomas doesn't suspect a thing." Olga's heart sank. Gabriela's web of lies grew ever larger, and she dreaded the day it would all unravel, leaving her son devastated. The next morning, the Acosta Gutierrez house was buzzing with activity. Gabriela had invited her friends, transforming the modest living room into a stage for her perfect hostess act. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with cheap perfume and loud laughter. Olga moved quietly among the women, serving snacks she had prepared with limited resources. Her tired eyes noticed how quickly the provisions that should last a week were disappearing. "Olga, bring more pastries," Gabriela ordered in a falsely sweet tone. Her friends, Lucia and Marta, exchanged knowing glances. "Oh, Gabriela, how lucky you are to have your mother-in-law to help," Lucia commented with false admiration. Gabriela smiled with malice. "Yes, it's a blessing," she replied, her tone laden with sarcasm that Olga painfully sensed. As Olga retreated to the kitchen, the women's voices lowered. "Hey, Gabi, what about that handsome neighbor you told us about?" Marta asked conspiratorially. Gabriela's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Oh, Juan, we're meeting tomorrow," she whispered, winking. "Tomas thinks I'm going to the market." The women's laughter filled the room, oblivious to the pain their words caused. From the kitchen, Olga felt each laugh like a stab. Her daughter-in-law not only squandered their meager funds, but was also planning to betray her son. Suddenly, Gabriela's phone buzzed with a message from Juan. Gabriela read it with a smile that didn't go unnoticed by her friends. Well, someone seems excited," Lucia joked. Gabriela quickly put away her phone. "Don't be silly, it's just a friend." But her smile said otherwise. Olga, returning with more snacks, saw the expression on her daughter-in-law's face and felt a chill. She recognized that look, the same one Gabriela had when she deceived Tomas into marrying her. Hours passed amid gossip and laughter as the fridge emptied and supplies dwindled. When the friends finally left, they left behind a messy house and an almost empty pantry. Exhausted, Olga began cleaning silently while Gabriela, without offering any help, retreated to her room, already planning her next secret rendezvous. The air in the house felt heavy with secrets and lies, threatening to destroy the fragile family peace. Tension at the Acosta Gutierrez home had reached a critical point. Olga, worn out from days of relentless work and worry, was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Gabriela entered with a disgusted look. "Olga, what's this mess?" Gabriela snapped, pointing at some unwashed dishes in the sink. "Can't you do anything right?" The elderly woman, taken aback by the sudden aggression, tried to explain. "I'm sorry, Gabriela. I was about to wash them." "Stop making excuses," Gabriela shouted, her voice rising dangerously. "I'm fed up with living in this dump. If you can't keep the house in order, what good are you?" Olga, wounded by the cruel words, felt something inside her snap. Years of silent abuse and manipulation exploded at that moment. "Enough, Gabriella," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I've endured your mistreatment for too long. This is my home, not yours." Gabriella's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Your home? Do you think you have any right here? Without me, Tomas would have sent you to a nursing home years ago." "You're lying," Olga retorted, her voice gaining strength. "Tomas loves me. If he knew the truth about how you waste our money and how you're unfaithful." Gabriella's face contorted with rage. In a fit of fury, she grabbed a plate and threw it on the floor, shattering it into pieces. "Shut up, you old fool. You have no proof. Do you think Tomas would believe you over me?" Olga recoiled, frightened by Gabriella's violence. "I won't let you keep destroying this family," she said determinedly. Gabriella moved menacingly closer. "Listen, Olga, this is my house now, and if you don't like it, you can leave. In fact, maybe it's time for you to go." "You can't kick me out," Olga replied, though fear seeped into her voice. "Want to bet?" Gabriella challenged, a cruel smile curving her lips. "I warn you, Olga, one wrong move and you'll find yourself on the street faster than you can imagine." The sound of the front door interrupted the confrontation. Tomas had arrived. Gabriella instantly changed her expression, adopting a mask of sweetness. "Remember, Olga," she whispered threateningly before going to greet her husband. "One word and you're out." Olga remained in the kitchen, trembling amid the broken plate's remnants. Gabriella's threat loomed over her like a dark cloud foretelling the storm to come. The days following the confrontation were a silent agony for Olga. Gabriella, cunning and methodical, began executing her plan to get rid of the old woman without raising Tomas's suspicions. One morning, as Tomas was preparing for work, Gabriella approached him with a worried expression. "Darling, have you noticed anything strange about your mother lately?" Tomas, distracted, barely looked up. "What do you mean?" "Well," Gabriella lowered her voice, "I've seen her talking to herself, forgetting things. I'm worried she might be developing some kind of dementia." With the seed of doubt planted, Gabriella orchestrated situations that cast doubt on Olga's sanity. She hid objects and blamed the old woman for losing them, changed the times on clocks, and feigned surprise when Olga confused meals. Olga, aware of the manipulation but powerless to defend herself, watched as her world crumbled. Every time she tried to speak with Tomas, Gabriella interrupted or twisted her words. One afternoon, Gabriella delivered the final blow. Taking advantage of Olga's nap, she placed some family jewels in a visible spot. Gabriella, with fake tears in her eyes, confronted Tomas, saying, "Darling, I didn't want to believe it, but I found this among your mother's things," showing him the jewelry. "I think she's been stealing." Tomas, stunned and confused, wasn't sure what to think. "There must be an explanation," he murmured, but doubt had already been planted. Gabriella pressed on. Perhaps it's time to consider a nursing home for her own good. That night, during dinner, Tomas brought up the issue with his mother. "Mom, have you noticed any memory problems lately?" Olga, taken aback, shook her head. "No, son. Why do you ask?" Gabriella gently interjected, "Olga, we found the jewelry in your bag. If you needed money, you should have asked." The elderly woman, horrified, tried to defend herself, but her protests seemed weak against Gabriella's evidence. By the end of the night, a decision was made. With a broken heart, Olga was informed she would be moved to a safe place in a few days. As Tomas left, overwhelmed by the situation, Gabriella shot a triumphant look at Olga. Her plan had worked. Soon the house would be hers alone, and she could live as she always wished, free from her mother-in-law's presence. In her room, Olga cried silently, not only losing her home, but also her son's trust. The darkness surrounding her seemed impenetrable. The night was cold and damp when Olga found herself on the city streets, her hunched figure barely visible under the dim streetlights, with only a worn suitcase and the coat she wore. The old woman wandered aimlessly, still stunned by the events that led her to this desperate situation. Hours earlier, while Tomas was at work, Gabriella had executed the final phase of her plan. With a cruel smile, she handed Olga an envelope with a small amount of money. "It's time for you to leave, old woman. Don't even think about coming back or telling Tomas anything. No one will believe you." Olga, with tears in her eyes, begged, "Please, Gabriela, this is my home. Where will I go?" "That's not my problem," Gabriela replied, closing the door in her face. Now, on the unfamiliar and hostile streets, Olga felt the weight of her 70 years. She sat on a park bench, shivering from cold and fear. Shadows seemed to move around her, and every noise startled her. Some young people passed by, laughing and talking loudly. Olga huddled, trying to become invisible. One of them noticed her and approached. "Hey, Grandma, are you lost?" "No," Olga murmured, clutching her suitcase. The young man frowned, a mix of curiosity and concern on his face. "You shouldn't be here alone. It's dangerous." Olga nodded weakly, but didn't move. Where could she go? As the young people walked away, Olga allowed herself to cry silently, thinking of Tomas and how Gabriela's manipulation had blinded him. How could her own son believe she was stealing and losing her mind as the night wore on? As the cold intensified, Olga walked until she found a semi-open doorway to take shelter. She huddled in a corner, using her suitcase as a pillow. Sleep eluded her, interrupted by the city noise and constant fear. In the early morning, a police officer found her. "Mum, you can't stay here," he said, his voice a mix of authority and compassion. "I have nowhere to go," Olga replied, her voice barely a whisper. The officer sighed, offering her the address of a nearby shelter. Olga nodded gratefully but knew she wouldn't go. Shame and wounded pride kept her from seeking help. As dawn painted the sky grey, Olga, aching and weary, continued her walk. The streets were beginning to fill with people going to work, all ignoring the old woman wandering aimlessly. Olga felt invisible, a ghost in a city she once called home. In that moment, looking at the indifferent faces of passers-by, Olga realized the harsh reality of her situation. She was alone, homeless, and facing an uncertain future on the city's unforgiving streets. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of the Acosta Gutierrez home, illuminating the kitchen where Tomas was absent-mindedly having breakfast. Gabriela, with a coffee cup in hand, watched her husband with a mix of satisfaction and anxiety. "Darling," Gabriela began, her voice carefully modulated to sound concerned. "Have you heard from your mother?" Tomas looked up, frowning. "I thought she was in her room. Haven't you seen her?" Gabriela let out a theatrical sigh. "When I went to bring her breakfast, she wasn't there. Her bed is made and some of her things are missing." Tomas's face went pale. "What do you mean she's not there? Where could she have gone?" Gabriela sat next to him, taking his hand with feigned concern. "I don't know, dear. Maybe she decided to leave on her own. You know how she's been lately, confused." Tomas stood up abruptly. "There must be an explanation. I'm calling the police." While Tomas made the call, Gabriela hid a triumphant smile. Her plan was working perfectly. The following hours were a whirlwind of activity. The police arrived, asked questions, took notes. Gabriela played the part of the concerned daughter-in-law perfectly, providing carefully fabricated details about Olga's mental decline. "She's been acting strangely," she explained to the officers, crocodile tears in her eyes. "Forgetting things, mixing up times. We even found some family jewelry in her belongings. We didn't want to believe she took it, but..." Tomas, devastated, confirmed the story, unknowingly sealing his mother's fate. "It's true, she's been different lately, but I never thought she'd just leave." After the police left, promising to do their best to find Olga, Gabriela embraced Tomas, offering false comfort. "She'll be found, love, I'm sure." That night, while Tomas slept, Gabriela slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen, retrieving the phone she had hidden days before. She turned it on briefly, sent a short message from Olga's number to Tomas. "I need time for myself, don't look for me," then turned it off and hid it again. She returned to bed, satisfied. She had planted the final seed of doubt. Now, even if Olga returned, no one would believe her story. Gabriela had won, and the house, along with the life she had always wanted, would finally be hers. What Gabriela didn't know was that her victory was built on sand. Lies, no matter how elaborate, have a way of surfacing, and fate was weaving a net that would soon ensnare her in her own web of deceit. The neighborhood where the Acosta Gutierrez family lived had descended into an atmosphere of unease. 2 weeks after Olga's disappearance, a new drama shook the community. The mysterious disappearance of the Ramirez siblings, 8-year-old Sofia and 6-year-old Miguel. Gabriela watched from the window as the police went door to door, asking questions and handing out flyers with the children's photos. Her heart raced, a mix of excitement and fear coursing through her veins. Tomas came home from work, his face gloomy, reflecting the general worry of the neighborhood. "It's terrible," he said, sinking into the sofa. "First Mum, and now these kids. What's happening around here?" Gabriela sat beside him, offering a consoling touch. "It's horrible, love. Those poor children and their parents must be devastated." At that moment, the doorbell rang. It was Juan, the neighbor Gabriela had been flirting with. "Sorry for the intrusion," he said, his voice tense. "The police are asking everyone to check their properties in case the kids are hiding somewhere." Tomas nodded and got up to help with the search. Gabriela stayed behind, exchanging a loaded glance with Juan before he left. That night, while Tomas slept, Gabriela sneaked down to the basement. In a dark corner hidden behind old boxes, a small device was blinking. Gabriela picked it up, her hands trembling slightly. It was a disposable phone. She dialed a number she knew by heart. "Are they secure?" she whispered when the call was answered. "They can't be found. They can't stay here. Move them." She hung up quickly, destroyed the phone, and buried it in the garden under the moonlight. When she returned to bed, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The children's disappearance was no coincidence. Gabriela was involved in something much darker and more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The following days were a frenzy of police activity and community distress. Gabriela played her role of the concerned neighbor perfectly, offering help and comfort to the missing children's parents. But in the privacy of her thoughts, Gabriela reveled in her secret. The child trafficking network she was involved in promised the wealth she had always dreamed of. The Ramirez children were just the beginning of what Gabriela didn't realize was a chain of events that would soon converge catastrophically. The truth, like a dormant beast, was beginning to stir, and when it awoke, no one would be safe from its claws. The night cloaked the city in darkness as Olga, exhausted and hungry, took refuge in an alley behind a restaurant. She had been wandering the streets for days, surviving on charity from strangers and scraps found in dumpsters. Her once pristine clothes were now dirty and wrinkled, her face, once kind, now etched with suffering and desperation. As she rummaged through a dumpster searching for something edible, a voice startled her. She turned quickly, fearing an attacker, but came face to face with an older man who looked kind and calm. "I'm Carlos," he said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I work here," he pointed to the restaurant's back door. "I've seen you around these days. Do you need help?" Initially wary, Olga felt she could trust him. With a trembling voice, she began to share her story. Carlos listened intently, his face reflecting a mix of compassion and outrage. "That's awful," he said when Olga finished, "but there's something else you need to know. I've heard rumors about your daughter-in-law, Gabriela." Olga's heart skipped a beat. What rumors? Carlos glanced around to ensure no one was listening. "People are talking. They say she's been seen with dangerous individuals, and now with the disappearance of those kids in the neighborhood." Olga gasped, clutching her chest. "What kids? What happened?" Carlos told her about the Ramirez siblings' disappearance and how it coincided with the time Olga had been forced out of her home. "Some people think your daughter-in-law might be involved in something shady." Olga's mind raced, connecting the dots. She recalled half-heard conversations, suspicious behavior from Gabriela. It all started to make a terrible sense. "I need to do something," Olga said, standing with determination. "I can't let Gabriela continue to harm others." Carlos nodded sympathetically. "I'll help you. I know someone in the police who might listen to us, but we need to be careful. If what we suspect is true, we're dealing with very dangerous people." That night, while the city slept, Olga and Carlos began planning how to expose Gabriela and her criminal network. For the first time in weeks, Olga felt a spark of hope. She might not only clear her name and reunite with her son, but also save innocent lives from a terrible fate. What Olga didn't know was that her resolve was about to trigger a series of events that would shake the foundations of her family and the entire neighborhood. The truth, hidden for so long, was about to come to light, and no one was prepared for the consequences it would bring. The sun barely peeked through the horizon as Gabriela stealthily left the house, dressed in black and wearing dark glasses. She slipped through the still empty streets until she reached a rundown cafe on the city's outskirts. The dilapidated and gloomy place seemed perfect for clandestine meetings. Inside, a rugged-looking man waited at a table in the back. "You're late," he grumbled as Gabriela took a seat across from him. "I had to make sure Tomas didn't suspect anything," she replied, removing her glasses. "Is everything ready?" The man nodded. "The kids are already on their way to the drop-off point, but we have a problem. The police are asking too many questions." Gabriela frowned. "I took care of that. I gave them false leads." "That's not enough," he retorted. "We need a bigger distraction, something to completely divert their attention." Gabriela thought for a moment, her eyes gleaming with a sinister idea. "The old woman," she murmured. "My mother-in-law. We can use her disappearance." The man looked at her, intrigued. "How will we plant evidence?" Gabriela's voice was laden with malice. "We'll make it look like she took the kids. An old woman, disturbed and desperate for a family. It's perfect." Her accomplice smiled, impressed by the plan's cruelty. "You're ruthless, Gabriela. I like it." As they discussed the details, neither of them noticed the waitress watching them discreetly from the bar. The young woman, heart racing, memorized every word and gesture. When Gabriela left, the waitress hurried to the back room, pulled out an old phone from her pocket, and dialed a number with trembling fingers. "Carlos, it's me, Lucia. You were right. The woman came today and I heard terrible things." On the other end of the line, Carlos listened intently with Olga by his side. The old woman, upon hearing the summary of the conversation, felt her world crashing down. Her daughter-in-law had not only thrown her out of her home, but was now plotting to frame her for a heinous crime. "We have to act now," Olga said, her voice trembling with rage and fear. "I can't let her hurt more children." Carlos nodded, his face serious. "I'll contact my friend in the police, but Olga, you need to understand, this is dangerous. Gabriela and her network won't stop at anything." Olga stood tall, a fierce determination shining in her tired eyes. "I've lost my home, my family, and my dignity. I have nothing left to lose, but those kids, they have everything ahead of them. I'll do whatever it takes to save them." As the sun climbed in the sky, lighting up the city that remained unaware of the drama unfolding within, Olga and her allies began to weave a net to catch Gabriela. The final battle was about to begin, and the fate of many hung by a thread. The rain fell relentlessly over the city, as if the heavens themselves mourned the missing children. Olga, sheltered under a worn awning, watched the police station across the street, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and fear. Carlos appeared at her side, shaking off the rain. "The water from your jacket," he said. "My contact will see us in 10 minutes. Are you ready?" Olga nodded, her resolve unwavering despite the fear gnawing at her. Together, they crossed the street and entered the station. Detective Ramirez, a middle-aged man with tired yet alert eyes, greeted them in a small interrogation room. "Carlos mentioned you have information about the missing children," he began, his tone skeptical but attentive. Olga took a deep breath and started recounting her story. She described how Gabriela had forced her out of her home, her suspicions over the years, and finally, the conversation Lucia had overheard at the cafe. Detective Ramirez listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each word. When Olga finished, he was silent for a moment, processing the information. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I understand you've been through a lot, but these are very serious accusations. We need concrete evidence to take action." Olga felt her heart sink. "But the conversation Lucia heard is circumstantial," she interjected. "That could be misinterpreted," the detective replied. "We need something more solid." Carlos stepped in. "Detective, we understand the risks, but think about those children. If there's even a chance this is true, isn't it worth investigating?" Detective Ramirez rubbed his forehead, visibly conflicted. "Look, I can't initiate a formal investigation based solely on this. But," he lowered his voice, "I can make some discreet inquiries. If we find something, then we can proceed officially." Olga felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Detective. That's all we ask." As they left the station, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavy grey sky. Olga looked at Carlos, her face a mix of relief and concern. "What now?" she asked. Carlos placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Now we wait and stay alert. Gabriela must not suspect we're onto her." What they didn't know was that at that very moment, across the city, Gabriela was receiving a call that would set off a chain of events, unraveling the web of lies and bringing the truth to light, with devastating consequences for everyone involved. As the sunset bathed the sky in orange, Tomas returned home, his face etched with exhaustion and worry. Weeks had passed since his mother and the neighborhood children disappeared, and the tension in the air was palpable. Entering the house, he found Gabriela seated on the sofa, her gaze fixed on the TV, where local news repeated images of the missing children. She turned towards him, a rehearsed smile on her lips. "How was your day, love?" she asked with feigned sweetness. Tomas sank heavily beside her. "Exhausting. I can't stop thinking about Mom and those poor children. I feel like something is off with Gabriela." Gabriela quickly masked her surprise. "What do you mean, darling?" Tomas rubbed his forehead, confusion evident in his eyes. "I don't know. It's just, doesn't it seem strange that Mom disappeared right before the kids did? And that message I received, it doesn't sound like something she'd say." Gabriela's heart raced. Was Tomas beginning to suspect? She needed to act swiftly. "Tomas," she said, taking his hand with feigned concern, "I know it's hard, but we have to face the possibility that your mother wasn't well. Maybe she had something to do with the children." Tomas stood abruptly, his face a mix of shock and indignation. "How can you say that? She's my mother." "I know, love," Gabriela replied, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But think about it. Her erratic behavior, the jewels we found. Maybe, in her confusion, she took the children thinking they were, well, perhaps her grandchildren." Tomas fell silent, struggling with the idea. He wanted to defend his mother, but the evidence Gabriela had meticulously planted over weeks was starting to erode his certainty. "No, it can't be," he murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. Gabriela moved closer, hugging him. "I know it's hard, my love, but we need to consider all possibilities for the sake of those children." As she comforted Tomas, Gabriela smiled inwardly, her plan working. She had sown doubt in her husband's mind, distancing him further from the truth. What Gabriela didn't know was that at that very moment, Detective Ramirez was uncovering a crucial lead linking Gabriela to the children's disappearance. The web of lies she had carefully woven was beginning to unravel, and soon she would face the consequences of her actions. Night fell over the city, bringing with it the promise of revelations that would shake the very foundations of everyone involved. Early morning found Detective Ramirez in his office, surrounded by files and empty coffee cups. His bloodshot eyes scanned a series of documents spread across his desk. Suddenly, his gaze fixed on a particular paper. "This can't be," he murmured, bringing the document into the light. It was a bank statement for Gabriela Callejas. Among the routine transactions were a series of suspicious deposits, all of the same amount, made on dates that matched the disappearances of children around the city. The detective jumped up, his fatigue forgotten. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number. "Carlos, it's me," he said as soon as the line picked up. "You were right. There's something big here." Across town, in a borrowed apartment, Olga listened intently as Carlos spoke on the phone. Her heart raced with a mix of vindication and horror at the confirmation of her suspicions. Meanwhile, back at the Acosta Gutierrez house, Gabriela awoke with a start as her phone buzzed persistently. With trembling hands, she picked it up and read the message. "The police are closing in. We need to move the goods now." Fear gripped her. How had things gotten so far? She glanced at Tomas, sleeping unaware, and briefly considered waking him to confess everything, but survival instincts prevailed. Quietly, she dressed and left the house. The night was cold and the streets were empty. Gabriela headed to an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts, where she knew the children were held before their transfer. What she didn't realize was that Detective Ramirez and his team were already on the move, having tracked Gabriela's phone and were now following her at a safe distance. Inside the warehouse, Gabriela met her accomplices, the tension palpable. "What do we do with the kids?" one asked. Gabriela, with a chilling detachment that even surprised her partners, replied, "Get rid of them. We can't leave any evidence." Just then, police sirens shattered the night's silence, lights and shouting filling the air as officers surrounded the building. "Police! You're surrounded!" Chaos erupted. Gabriela tried to flee but was quickly captured. As she was handcuffed, she watched the children being taken out, her eyes locked with Detective Ramirez's, who looked at her with a mix of disgust and triumph. The child trafficking ring had been dismantled, but for Gabriela, this was just the beginning. The consequences of her actions were about to catch up, and the price would be higher than she ever imagined. Dawn found Olga sitting in Carlos's small kitchen, clutching a cold cup of coffee. The news of the police operation and the children's rescue had come just hours earlier, stirring a whirlwind of emotions. Carlos entered, his face showing fatigue but with a glint of triumph in his eyes. "Olga," Detective Ramirez called. "He wants you to go to the station. It's time to tell your story officially." Olga nodded slowly, a mix of relief and apprehension flooding her. "Does Tomas know anything?" Carlos shook his head. "Not yet. The detective thinks it's better you tell him the truth first." With trembling legs, Olga braced herself for the day that would change everything. As they headed to the police station, the streets buzzed with activity. The news of the trafficking ring's dismantling spread like wildfire, and the city seemed to awaken from a collective nightmare. At the station, Detective Ramirez greeted them with a grave expression. "Mrs. Gutierrez, your testimony will be crucial in closing this case. But first, you should know something. Gabriela has implicated your son, Tomas, in the crimes." The world seemed to stop for Olga. "No, it can't be. Tomas..." The detective raised a hand to calm her. "We don't believe he's involved, but Gabriela is trying to drag him down with her." With renewed determination, Olga stood tall. "I'll do whatever it takes. My son is innocent, and that woman won't destroy the last thing I have." Over the next few hours, Olga recounted every detail of her ordeal, how Gabriela had manipulated her, the suspicions she had harbored, and how she had been forced out of her own home. Each word was a step closer to truth and justice. Meanwhile, in another room of the station, Tomas was being interrogated, bewildered and devastated by the revelations about Gabriela. He struggled to grasp how his life had unraveled in mere hours. By the end of the day, exhausted but resolute, Olga and Tomas reunited. The moment was charged with emotions, regret, but also a deep love that had weathered the storm. "Mom," Tomas whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, I should have..." Olga embraced him tightly, her own face wet. "It's okay, son. We're together now. That's what matters." As mother and son reconciled outside the station, reporters clamored for details about the case that had rocked the city. The story of Olga, the brave woman who had helped dismantle a criminal ring, was about to unfold, bringing a wave of changes no one could foresee. The police station's press room buzzed with activity as local media crowded with cameras and microphones aimed at the podium where the police chief prepared to speak. In the front row, Olga and Tomas waited with a mix of nervousness and anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," began the chief, his deep voice filling the room, "today we announce the dismantling of one of the largest child trafficking rings in our city." A murmur swept through the crowd. The chief continued, detailing the operation and the rescue of the children. Then, with a dramatic pause, he added, "This victory would not have been possible without the bravery and determination of an extraordinary citizen, Mrs. Olga Gutierrez. Please come forward." With trembling legs but held high, Olga approached the podium. The camera flashes temporarily blinded her. "Mrs. Gutierrez," continued the chief, "despite being a victim of a cruel deception that left her homeless, she never ceased fighting for the truth. Her testimony was crucial in solving this case." The journalists erupted with questions. Overwhelmed but resolute, Olga began to share her story, detailing Gabriela's manipulations, her expulsion from her home, her suspicions, and how, with the help of compassionate individuals, she had uncovered the truth. As Olga spoke, Tomas watched with a mix of admiration and remorse. Each of his mother's words a painful reminder of how he had failed to protect her and how he had been deceived by Gabriela. The doors of the room burst open as Gabriela, handcuffed and escorted by 2 officers, was led through the throng of journalists. Her eyes, filled with rage and desperation, fixed on Olga. "Liar!" Gabriela screamed. "This is all your fault! Tomas, tell them the truth!" Chaos erupted in the room as journalists went wild, cameras swiveling toward Gabriela and flashes multiplied. In a bold move that surprised even himself, Tomas stood up. "The only liar here is you, Gabriela," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "It's over. You can't manipulate us anymore." Watching her last chance to escape crumble, Gabriela collapsed. The officers quickly escorted her out, her screams fading into the distance. The police chief, regaining control of the situation, concluded the press conference, but the damage was done. Gabriela's unexpected appearance had added a dramatic twist to an already sensational story. As Olga and Tomas left the station, surrounded by reporters shouting questions, they both knew their lives would never be the same. The truth had been revealed, but the road to healing had only just begun. In the streets, the news spread like wildfire. Olga's story, the brave woman who had helped dismantle a criminal ring, captivated the public's imagination. No one could predict the impact this turn of events would have on everyone involved. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind for Olga and Tomas. The story had captured national attention, turning Olga into a symbol of courage and resilience. Journalists camped out in front of Tomas's modest home, where Olga had temporarily moved, eager for more details about the local heroine. One afternoon, as Olga was making tea in the kitchen, Tomas entered with a worried expression. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, sitting heavily in a chair. "The prosecutor wants you to testify in Gabriela's trial." Olga set down the kettle and sat across from her son. "I know, son. Detective Ramirez told me yesterday." Tomas took his mother's hands in his own. "You don't have to do it if you don't want to. You've been through so much." "I have to do it, Tomas," Olga interrupted gently but firmly. "For those children, for their families, and for us, we need to close this chapter." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Tomas answered and returned with a look of surprise. "Mom, it's Mrs. Ramirez. The mother of the rescued children wants to talk to you." Olga rose, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. In the living room, a tired-looking woman with eyes full of gratitude awaited. "Mrs. Gutierrez," the woman began, her voice breaking, "I just wanted to thank you. You saved my children. I can never repay what you've done." Moved, Olga embraced the woman. "There's no need to thank me. Any mother would have done the same." As the two women shed tears and comforting words, Tomas watched from the doorway, overwhelmed by the weight of his guilt for doubting his mother and believing Gabriela's lies. "Mom," he interrupted gently, "there's something I need to tell you. I'm so sorry. I should have believed you. I should have seen through Gabriela's lies. I failed you." Olga approached her son, cradling his face in her hands. "My dear, don't blame yourself. Gabriela deceived us all. What matters now is that we're together and the truth has come out." Mrs. Ramirez, moved by the scene, added, "Your mother is right, Mr. Acosta. You are victims in this too." As the three of them shared a moment of mutual understanding and forgiveness, the city outside remained shaken by the revelations. Olga's story had struck a chord in society, sparking discussions about elder abuse, human trafficking, and the importance of not judging by appearances. The trial against Gabriela loomed, promising justice, but for Olga and Tomas, the real challenge was just beginning, rebuilding their relationship and healing past wounds. On the day of the trial, the sky was grey and cold, mirroring the gravity of the events about to unfold. The courtroom was packed with journalists, shocked citizens, and victims' families, filling every available space. Olga, dressed in a simple but elegant suit, sat in the front row beside Tomas. Her hands, wrinkled by age and recent hardships, clutched a handkerchief. Despite her resolve, a slight tremor shook her body. "Everything will be all right, Mom," Tomas whispered, gently squeezing Olga's shoulder. The murmurs in the room subsided as Gabriela was escorted in. Her appearance starkly contrasted with the elegant, confident woman she once was. She looked pale, with pronounced dark circles and disheveled hair, casting a hateful glance at Olga before sitting with her attorney. The judge entered, and the trial began. The prosecution meticulously laid out the case against Gabriela: child trafficking, money laundering, and her cruel treatment of Olga. Each piece of evidence felt like a blow to Tomas, who struggled to reconcile the woman he had loved with the monster revealed in court. When it was Olga's turn to testify, the courtroom held its breath. Her voice started tremulously, but gained strength with every word as she recounted her ordeal, her mistreatment, being thrown out of her own home, her suspicions, and how she had managed to uncover the truth against all odds. "I only wanted to protect my family," Olga concluded, her voice thick with emotion. "I never imagined I would be fighting something so terrible." During cross-examination, Gabriela's lawyer attempted to discredit Olga, suggesting that her advanced age might have compromised her credibility. Gabriela, who had surprised everyone by pleading guilty to all charges, did so with a chilling lack of remorse. "Yes, I did it all," she declared coldly, sending shivers through the room, "and I would do it again. This world belongs to the strong, those who dare to take what they want. You," she directed her gaze at Olga and Tomas, "are weak and deserve nothing." Her words stirred outrage in the courtroom, prompting the judge to repeatedly call for order. Tomas, devastated by the cruelty of the woman he once loved, embraced his mother, seeking as much comfort as he gave. The verdict was unanimous. Gabriela was found guilty on all counts. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, her eyes met Olga's one final time. In that brief moment, Olga saw neither hatred nor remorse in Gabriela's gaze, only a terrifying emptiness. Emerging from the courthouse, surrounded by a throng of reporters and supporters, Olga and Tomas faced a new chapter in their lives. Justice had been served, but the path to healing had only just begun. The days following the trial passed in a strange limbo for Olga and Tomas. The media frenzy gradually waned, leaving behind a heavy silence in the small house they now shared. One afternoon, as Olga was preparing dinner, Tomas entered the kitchen with a despondent look. "Mom, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. Olga turned off the stove and sat down, her face a blend of concern and maternal love. "What's wrong, son?" Tomas took a deep breath, struggling for the right words. "I've decided to leave for a while," he finally admitted. "I need to think, to get away from all of this." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken feelings. Olga's heart ached, but she strove to remain composed. "Where will you go?" she asked softly. "A friend has a cabin in the mountains," Tomas replied, avoiding his mother's gaze. "I'll be there for a few weeks, maybe a month. I need to sort out my thoughts. Gabriela, the trial, realizing how blind I've been. It's too much." Olga reached across the table, taking her son's hand. "I understand, my dear. Sometimes we need to distance ourselves to gain clarity." Tomas looked up, surprised by his mother's understanding. "Aren't you upset?" he asked. "Of course not," Olga smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm worried, yes, but I understand you need this time. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself and come back." "I promise, Mom," Tomas said, squeezing his mother's hand. That night, as Tomas packed his bags, Olga sat on the porch, gazing at the starry sky. Her heart was torn between the pain of watching her son leave and the hope that this journey would help him find his way. The next morning, with the sun barely peeking over the horizon, Tomas said his goodbyes. The embrace between mother and son was long and filled with emotion. "I'll be back soon," Tomas promised, before getting into his car. Olga watched him drive away, her face a mix of pride and sadness. As the car vanished from sight, she returned to the now too large and silent house. In the kitchen, she found a note from Tomas. "Mom, thank you for your strength and unconditional love. I'm going to find the peace I need to become the son you deserve. I love you." Olga pressed the note to her chest, allowing herself to cry for the first time since the trial, tears of sadness, relief, and hope. She knew the path to healing would be long and arduous for both her and Tomas, but she was ready to take it one step at a time, day by day. Time passed slowly in the quiet house, with days blending together, marked only by occasional calls from Tomas in the mountains. Each conversation was a balm for her heart, but also a bittersweet reminder of the distance between them. One morning, as Olga tended to the garden, an unfamiliar car pulled up outside. A well-dressed middle-aged woman with a briefcase stepped out and approached with purpose. "Mrs. Olga Gutierrez?" the woman asked in a professional tone. Olga, intrigued and a bit apprehensive, nodded. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" The woman extended her hand. "I'm Patricia Mendoza, a television producer. We're interested in bringing your story to the screen." Olga was momentarily speechless. "My story? But why?" Patricia smiled. "Your bravery and fight against injustice have inspired many people, Mrs. Gutierrez. We believe your story deserves to be told." Olga invited Patricia inside, and they spent the next few hours discussing the proposal. Patricia spoke about scripts, rights, and interviews, while Olga listened, overwhelmed by the scope of what was being offered. "I need to think about it," Olga said finally, "and discuss it with my son." Patricia nodded understandingly. "Of course, take your time." That night, Olga called Tomas, her voice trembling with emotion as she shared the offer. "It's your decision, Mom," Tomas said after a long pause, "but I think it could be good. Your story might help a lot of people." Tomas's words resonated with Olga. Could her suffering serve a greater purpose? The following days were a whirlwind of meetings and decisions. With the help of a lawyer recommended by Detective Ramirez, Olga negotiated the terms of the agreement, insisting that part of the proceeds go to organizations supporting trafficking victims and abused elderly individuals. As she signed the contract, Olga felt a mix of nervousness and resolve. Her life, once thought to be over when Gabriella had thrown her out, was taking an unexpected turn she had never imagined. The news leaked to the press, and soon Olga's story began to unfold in the media. Once again in the media spotlight, Olga felt more prepared and stronger than before. One afternoon, while reviewing the script draft with Patricia, she received a message from Tomas. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I'm coming home tomorrow. It's time to face the future together." Olga smiled, her eyes shimmering with tears of joy. The journey had been challenging, but she saw now that every trial and every pain had led her to this moment. Her story, born from suffering, would become a beacon of hope for others. As the sun set, painting the sky in warm hues, Olga allowed herself to feel something she hadn't in a long time. Hope for the future and the certainty that, no matter what, she and Tomas would face it together. Tomas's return marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Acosta Gutierrez family. On the morning of his arrival, Olga waited anxiously on the porch, her heart racing with a blend of excitement and nervousness. When Tomas's car pulled up, time seemed to freeze. For a moment, Tomas got out of the vehicle, noticeably changed. He had lost weight, his beard was scruffy, but his eyes shone with a clarity Olga hadn't seen in years. They exchanged a look filled with unspoken emotions. "Mom," Tomas finally said, his voice wavering slightly. Unable to hold back any longer, Olga rushed to embrace her son. They held each other in a long hug, shedding silent tears that released all the pain, regret and love they had held in for so long. "I missed you so much," Olga whispered. "I missed you too, Mom. I'm sorry for leaving like I did," Tomas replied. They parted and went inside where a carefully prepared breakfast awaited them. As they ate, Tomas spoke about his time in the mountains, how he had faced his demons and come to terms with everything that had happened. "I realized a lot of things, Mom," Tomas said, his gaze fixed on his coffee cup. "How I let Gabriella manipulate me, how I failed you when you needed me most. But I also understand that I can't change the past. I can only learn from it and try to be better." Olga placed her hand on the table, holding his. "The important thing is that you're here now. We have a second chance, Tomas. We need to make the most of it." They talked for hours about the TV series proposal and Olga's plans. Tomas listened attentively, proud of how his mother had turned her pain into something positive. "I want to help, Mom," he said finally. "I want to be part of this. Maybe I can share my perspective and warn others about how someone can be manipulated without realizing it." Olga felt her heart swell with pride and love. "I'd love that, son." That night, mother and son sat on the porch, gazing at the stars. The air was filled with possibilities and promises of a better future. "You know, Mom," Tomas said softly, "while I was in the mountains, I remembered something Dad used to say. The stars shine brightest in the darkest times." After the darkest night, Olga smiled with tears shining in her eyes. "Your father was always wise," she said. As the night wore on, Olga and Tomas sat in silence, enjoying each other's company and the peace they had finally found. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, with wounds still needing healing and challenges to face. But now, united and strengthened by their trials, they felt ready for whatever came next. The past months had been a whirlwind for Olga and Tomas. The TV series production was in full swing, and they were immersed in a world they had never imagined. One sunny morning, they arrived on set, overwhelmed by the bustle of cameras, lights, and people rushing around. Patricia, the producer, greeted them with a warm smile. "Olga, Tomas, it's great you're here. Today is important," she said, leading them through the set. "We're filming the scene where Olga decides to confront Gabriella." Olga shivered, the memories of the trial still fresh. Tomas, sensing his mother's unease, gently squeezed her hand. "I'm here, Mom," he whispered. "We're in this together." They watched in silence as the actress playing Olga prepared for the scene. It was surreal to see their lives depicted before them. "Action!" shouted the director, and the scene came to life. As the actress delivered the words Olga had spoken months ago, the real Olga was transported back, reliving the fear, determination, and adrenaline of that pivotal moment. Cut! The director's voice brought her back to the present. Great take, Olga. How did it feel? With tears in her eyes, Olga nodded. It was like reliving it all over again, but this time I feel stronger. Tomas hugged his mother, proud of her strength. You're amazing, Mom. Your story is going to help so many people. During lunch, they shared with the cast and crew some anecdotes, not in the script. Laughter and tears mingled as the boundary between fiction and reality blurred. At the end of the day, as they headed home, Tomas noticed something different in his mother. She seemed lighter, as if she had shed a burden she had been carrying for a long time. How do you feel, Mom? He asked softly. Olga looked out the car window, a small smile on her lips. I feel at peace, son. Seeing our story told this way makes me realize how far we've come and that everything we went through will serve a greater purpose. Tomas nodded in understanding. Yes, I feel the same. It's like we're closing one chapter and starting a new one. As the sun set, painting the sky with warm hues, Olga and Tomas fell into a comfortable silence, both knowing that the road ahead would still have challenges, but feeling ready to face them together. They felt ready to face them together. The premiere of Redemption of a Mother was quickly approaching, and the city buzzed with anticipation as Olga and Tomas's faces appeared on billboards and TV ads everywhere. One afternoon, while Olga was making tea in the kitchen, the doorbell rang. Tomas answered to find Carlos, the man who had helped Olga when she was on the streets. Carlos, what a surprise! Tomas exclaimed, shaking his hand. Please, come in. Olga emerged from the kitchen, her face lighting up at the sight of him. The three of them settled in the living room, sharing tea and reminiscing. Carlos shared how his life had changed since helping Olga. After what happened, I decided to dedicate myself full-time to helping the homeless, he explained. Your story, Olga, inspired me to do more. Touched, Olga took Carlos's hand. I can never thank you enough for what you did for me. Carlos shook his head. No, Olga, you showed us all the power of perseverance and kindness. As they talked, Tomas noticed his mother seemed rejuvenated, her face brightening as she recalled the difficult times now seen as part of a growth journey. Suddenly, Tomas's phone rang. It was Patricia, the producer. Tomas, we have news. The series has been nominated for several TV awards, and they want you and Olga to attend the ceremony. The news hit like a bombshell in the room. Olga, stunned, looked at Tomas and then Carlos. Awards? But I just told my story. Excited, Tomas hugged his mother. It's more than that, Mom. Your story has touched many hearts. Carlos grinned widely. I told you, didn't I? Your story is special. That night, after Carlos left, Olga and Tomas sat on the porch, gazing at the stars as they once did. Did you ever imagine we'd get to this point, Mom? Tomas asked softly. Olga shook her head, her eyes sparkling with held-back tears. Never, son. There were times I didn't think I'd survive another day on the streets, and now you're an inspiration to many, Tomas said, embracing his mother. As the night sky stretched above them, they reflected on the incredible journey from housewife to homeless, from victim to heroine, a path Olga never could have imagined. You know, Tomas, she said finally, I think I understand what your father meant about stars shining brighter after the darkest night. Tomas nodded in understanding. Together, mother and son looked toward the future with a blend of anticipation and serenity, knowing that whatever came, they would face each new chapter of their lives together. On the night of the awards ceremony, the city was wrapped in a cloak of glamour and excitement. Olga, dressed in an elegant navy blue gown, looked at herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. Tomas, dashing in his tuxedo, entered the room. You look stunning, Mom, he said. With her voice filled with emotion, Olga turned, her eyes shimmering with a mix of nervousness and excitement. "Oh, Tomas, who would have thought we'd be here together?" They left the house where a limousine awaited them. The drive to the theatre was surreal, with streets lined with people holding signs supporting their heroine, Olga. Upon arriving at the theatre, they were greeted by a flurry of flashes and reporters' shouts. Olga clung to Tomas's arm, overwhelmed by the attention. "Mrs. Gutierrez, how are you feeling tonight?" a reporter shouted. "Grateful," Olga replied, her voice trembling but steady. "Grateful to be here with my son." Inside the theatre, they met the cast and crew of the series. The actress portraying Olga embraced her with tears in her eyes. "It's an honor to bring your story to life," she said. The ceremony began, and Olga and Tomas watched in awe as Redemption of a Mother won award after award: Best Script, Best Actress, Best Dramatic Series. Each victory was met with applause from the audience. Finally, the most important award of the night was announced. The Inspiration of the Year goes to Olga Gutierrez. The theatre erupted in applause. Stunned, Olga was guided to the stage by Tomas. Under the bright lights and in front of a crowd of hundreds, Olga took the microphone with trembling hands. I am not a hero," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "I'm just a mother who did what any mother would do: fight for the truth and justice. This award is not just mine. It belongs to everyone who helped me when I was on the streets, to the officers who believed in me, to my son who never lost faith." She paused, her eyes meeting Tomas's in the audience. "It's for everyone going through tough times right now. I want you to know there is hope. No matter how dark the night, a new day always comes." Tears streamed down her face, but Olga stood firm, her voice growing stronger. "This award is a reminder that kindness exists, that justice can prevail, and that it's never too late to start anew. Thank you all for believing in my story." The theatre rose to its feet, the applause thunderous. Tomas joined Olga on stage, hugging her as they both cried and laughed. The cameras captured the moment. Olga and Tomas looked at each other, their eyes reflecting all the love, pain, and hope they had shared. Under the bright lights and the roaring applause, they knew they had reached the end of one chapter of their lives and the beginning of a new, exciting one. The redemption they had long sought had finally arrived, not just for them, but for everyone whose lives had been touched by their story. The days following the awards ceremony were a whirlwind of interviews, public appearances, and recognition for Olga. On a sunny morning, Olga received an unexpected call from the mayor. "Mrs. Gutierrez," the mayor said with a solemn tone, "in recognition of your bravery and the positive impact you've had on our community, we want to name a new homeless assistance center in your honor." For a moment, Olga was speechless, overwhelmed with emotion. "I don't know what to say, Mr. Mayor. It's an honor." "The honor is ours, Mrs. Gutierrez," the mayor replied. "Your story has inspired many to take action." After hanging up, Olga called Tomas to share the news. They decided that this would be the next chapter in their mission, helping others who were facing similar struggles. On the day of the center's inauguration, a crowd had gathered in front of the new building, a modern and welcoming structure in the heart of the city. Olga and Tomas stood beside the mayor, ready to cut the ribbon. As Olga looked out at the crowd, she recognized many familiar faces. Carlos, the man who had helped her on the streets; Lucia, the waitress who had provided crucial information; Detective Ramirez, and even some of the children rescued from trafficking networks, now reunited with their families. With tears in her eyes, Olga took the microphone. "This center is not about me," she began, her voice warm. "It's about all of us, about the strength we find when we come together to help one another. Not long ago, I was on the streets without hope, but thanks to the kindness of strangers and a strength I didn't know I had, I'm here today." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This center is a beacon of hope, a place where those who have lost their way can find their path again. where those who have been forgotten can be remembered, where those who have lost hope can find it anew. Standing beside his mother, Tomas felt his heart swell with pride, watching as the crowd listened intently, many with tears in their eyes. Together, Olga continued, her voice growing stronger, we can create a world where no one has to face their battles alone, where compassion triumphs over cruelty, and where everyone, no matter their past, has the chance for a new beginning. With these words, Olga and Tomas cut the ribbon, officially opening the center. The applause and cheers of the crowd filled the air, mingling with tears of joy and hope. As people began to enter the center, Olga and Tomas lingered for a moment, reflecting on their journey. It had been long and painful, but from that suffering had emerged something beautiful and full of hope. "We did it, Mom," Tomas whispered, hugging Olga. Olga nodded, her eyes shining with a mix of tears and determination. "Yes, son, and this is just the beginning." Together, mother and son walked into the center, ready to begin this new chapter of their lives dedicated to restoring hope to those who, like them, once needed it. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting warm hues across the sky as Olga and Tomas sat on their porch, as they had done so many times before. But this time, it was filled with a serenity they hadn't experienced in a long while. Several months had passed since the opening of the assistance center, and life had found a new rhythm, one full of purpose and satisfaction. Olga split her time between the center, delivering inspiring talks, and personally helping those seeking a second chance. Tomas, in turn, had launched a legal counseling program for victims of abuse and trafficking. "You know, Mom," Tomas broke the comfortable silence, "sometimes I wonder what Dad would say if he could see us now." Olga smiled, her eyes gleaming with a mix of nostalgia and pride. "I think he'd be very proud of you, son." Tomas took his mother's hand. "We've come a long way." At that moment, Olga's phone buzzed with a message from Carlos. There was a new family at the center in urgent need of help. Olga looked at Tomas, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded, understanding without words. "Let's go," he said, rising and offering his hand to his mother. As they prepared to leave, Olga paused in front of the hallway mirror. The woman staring back was no longer the one who had been thrown out months ago. Her eyes sparkled with a strength and determination forged through trials and triumphs. "Ready?" Tomas asked, appearing behind her in the reflection. Olga nodded, a serene smile on her lips. "I'll always be ready to help others, son. It's what gives meaning to everything we've been through." Together, mother and son walked into the night that enveloped the city, towards the assistance center, a beacon of hope for those who, like them, once needed a new beginning. As they drove, Olga reflected on the incredible journey her life had been. From the deepest despair had emerged a purpose, a mission that now gave meaning to each day. "What are you thinking about, Mom?" Tomas asked, noticing the thoughtful expression on her face. Olga smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude and determination. "I think about how fortunate we are, Tomas, not just for having survived, but for having the chance to make a difference in others' lives." Tomas nodded in understanding. "Every person we help is a victory, right?" "Exactly," Olga replied. "And as long as we can continue to lend a hand to those in need, our own story of redemption will keep going." The car pulled up to the assistance center, where the lights shone like a beacon in the night. Olga and Tomas exchanged a look of understanding before stepping out. Vehicle ready to face any challenges ahead as they walked toward the entrance. Olga felt a deep sense of peace. Her journey had been long and painful, but each step had led them to this moment, a moment where they could turn their pain into hope for others. With every life they touched and every person they helped find their own path to redemption, Olga and Tomas were writing the final chapter of their story, a story of resilience, unconditional love, and the transformative power of compassion and second chances. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love your support by liking and subscribing to our channel. We also welcome your thoughts in the comments. It's incredibly rewarding for us to provide enjoyable content for our followers. Thank you so much for your unwavering support in every story. Blessings.